depends on the lively, freewheeling, free core of cities in which you have a lot of people trying to achieve their dreams, their goals, their lives. And in this kind of creative hubs that we have in cities, we find the specific characteristic that emerge as a positive phenomena for example, leading creation, innovation, technology, and etc. in all over the world during the last 5,000 years. But there is a problem because from maybe some Platonic views from the Greeks on, we have found a lot of critics and a lot of negative views related to the cities. For example, if we take this picture, it's a painting by Fra Carnevale, an Italian architect and painter from the 1400s. You may see this kind of more order, more rationalized, symmetric, pure, almost empty vision of what they were thinking cities were. And this kind of thoughts of the city not being this lively, freewheeling, emergent structure that humans create, but in opposition, this kind of completely orderly and hygienic view transmuted into urban planning. We have a lot of examples of this. We have, for example, the conceptions that Roman took about cities. They have this kind of a structure that was called the Cadus and the Comanum lines they used for founding military forts. And also they used the same structure for creating new cities over the territory. The main aim was to create these forts in which you can use to control the territory. And the same principle was inherited into the Spanish structure of city foundation that expanded all along Latin America and a little bit also in Spain and in the US, in the southern US. And what you found in these kind of conceptions is that you move away from the approach of the spontaneous order of cities in which everybody is creating cities by building first a farm, then houses, then maybe a shop, and then streets, forms, and then you have a place in which you had an empty place where a square was founded, and then you use that place as a market, and you go to completely structured and centralized vision of urban planning. There are thousands of examples like this. You have the foundation of the city of St. Petersburg in Russia by Peter the Great. You have the foundation of the city of Washington, for example, for the capital of the United States. And you can go all the way down to the 20th century, and you have, I mean, this city, Sofia, is a perfect example of the problems of central planning. I think that if you, I guess most of you live here, and you can experience those problems with this kind of communist buildings and the problems of the urban space that they create. But the main and the key point of urban planning was made during the 1900s. The problem that happened on the 19th century and on the 20th century was that the large scale of industrialization moved a lot of people from the countryside to the cities. And in this process, even though living standards were going up, the poverty and some problems regarding housing, regarding health, also air pollution, etc., were more visible now in cities than they had been on the countryside. And especially that was happening for intellectuals, because intellectuals that usually lived in cities didn't used to see the poverty and the problems of poverty in the farms, in mainly the countryside. But now they were seeing those problems in the cities. And most of these thoughts transmuted into what we can call modern urban planning during the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. An example of this kind of aims to reshape cities was, for example, Paris. Paris went through extremely huge reforms, starting on around the 1870s. In Paris, during the rule of the emperor, that is called that took also the help of Baron Haussmann, they made these huge reforms that basically were turning down a lot of houses and all constructions. They were putting new streets, new boulevards, and they were also providing like sewage, electricity. Well, at the beginning it was gas for street lighting and then electricity. But the thing was that even though the excuse they were using for making these reforms was just the improvement of cities' utilities, and maybe the cleaning of these old slums in order to provide better housing. In fact, what they were doing was they were opening these huge boulevards that were aimed to, and mainly designed for feeding large armies in order to repress revolts that had happened during the 1848. There was like a huge amount of revolutions and liberal rebellions in Europe, and the king and mainly the emperor and the kings were extremely preoccupied with this problem, so they decided to create some changes in the city in order to allow the armies to go inside the city and avoid barricades that were going on small medieval streets of Paris and other cities in Europe. These same conceptions went into the 20th century, and the best example of this kind of centralized thought of urban planning could be taken with Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier was a Swiss-born architect that worked a lot in France, but all over the world, and he was the first to put into words and into theory the key elements of central urban planning. He wrote 3 books. One is The City of the Future, The Sense of Urbanism, etc. He has many books about this. And in order to understand what he was thinking of when he talked and when he dealt with cities, we can quote him from one of his books. Here he said that the city is a work instrument. Multiplying disorder on them becomes insulting. A house is a living machine, and an office or factory are working machines. Architecture is organization. You, talking to the architect, are an organizer. Here you can see that he started dealing with what we may call maybe the problem of general plans. He laid out the foundations for modern urban planning, in which you try to develop this grandiose urban plan for central planning, in which you design the buildings, you design the streets, you decide how people are going to move, you zone the city out, so you put offices in one place, houses in another, the industry in the other, and you start trying to control these huge complexities that are usually are cities. Against these visions that were mainly developed during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, a really important architect that is not really well known nowadays, that was called Christopher Alexander. He was born in Austria, he studied in England, and he moved to the US to work. He developed a really important theoretical framework against central planning, because during the 60s and 70s, he started to notice some extremely huge problems regarding urban planning. And this happened because the first compounds and the first examples of these huge constructions in cities had been built during the 50s in most of European cities. So then after in the 60s and 70s, you were able to see the problems and the real failures they were presenting. If we want to understand a little bit his theoretical framework as a critic to central planning, we might quote him. And he said that architects and planners, no matter how much they are trained for their work, are not able to create an environment that prevails in the kind of variety and order which we seek. An organic balance can be achieved only through the action of a community in which each one shapes the parts of the environment he knows best. Only people themselves, part of a community, are able to lead a process of organic growth. They know their needs better than anyone and know exactly whether the buildings, the link between the buildings and public spaces serve or not serve. And if we recall a little bit of Hayek, of Hayekian theory, maybe we can understand, even though Alexander wasn't talking in Hayekian terms, he wasn't quoting Hayek and he wasn't studying Hayek, maybe we can understand that Alexander was trying to express the problem of the dispersion of knowledge applied to the architectural and urban planning field. In order to compare Alexander and Hayek, we might quote Hayek. Hayek said that there is beyond question a body of very important but unorganized knowledge, which cannot possibly be called scientific in the sense of knowledge of general rules, the knowledge of the particular circumstances of time and place. It is with respect to this that practically every individual has some advantage over all other. And here we may see how both authors are talking about this problem of the dispersion of knowledge, of the really important needed knowledge in order to create. In one case, you might call an economic order, or in another case we may call, for example, the urban order and the relations between the shopkeepers and the street and squares and buildings and the distribution of families and residences, etc. For example, one good example of this kind of emergent order is towns like you may typically see in the European fields. This is the town of Kreuzberg in Germany, but there are a lot of towns like this. I guess in Bulgaria there must be a lot of towns like this in which you can see how the distribution of land, the operation of houses, of squares, of streets, is all led by this evolving, slow process in which people have needs, they have resources, and they start in an emergent process to develop and to use the means and the resources they have in order to create an urban environment. The importance of this emergent order in Alexander's words is that the accurate organic emergent order of the accumulation of thousands of individual constructional acts through growth in small doses cannot be known in advance. It can only be gradually regenerated within a community that shares patterns and their diagnostic processes and take responsibility for their own designs and projects. An exact plan of what it will be cannot be performed. If you want it to work organically, it will be like positively and openly. We should let it grow from the community of users itself. And here Alexander, what he's trying to explain is that not only the positive order of cities is an emergent order, but also that you have a limitation on the design and the central planning of this order. This resembles an incredible similarity to the Hayekian problem of central planning. If we quote Hayek, for example, he said that this is the sort of knowledge of the kind which by its nature cannot enter into statistics and therefore cannot be conveyed to any central authority in a statistical form. The statistics which such a central authority would have to use would have to be arrived at precisely by abstracting from minor differences between the things, by lumping together as resources of one kind items which differ as regards location, quality, and other particulars. And in fact, for example, if you see maybe cities like Bruges in Belgium, you will find this kind of evolving and evolutionary process in which over time people are in fact shaping the urban environment in a positive way. And what is really important about this kind of scenarios is that you get to see that you have a common language, a kind of expression, evolving expression of order that develops over time and that changes and adapts to a special situation and to special periods of time. And Alexander called this process the timeless way of building. That would be like the urban expression of what maybe Hayek expressed as the method and the importance of what prices did in the economy, for example, or what norms and maybe evolving rules did on the social framework. Because societies tend to spontaneously generate some means and some rules that help them interact with each other. For example, prices contain important information about demand and supply that you don't necessarily need to know. You just need to see the price in order to guide your actions to be coordinated with other people. But also you have that in many cities and all over the world, people evolve and develop different kind of mechanisms that are not prices, that are other mechanisms, are like building materials, for example, building techniques, rules of how you're going to use the urban space that generates this kind of coherent and cooperative order without the need of having a central authority. Just to quote him and to understand his thoughts, he said that if we consider the last 2,000 or 3,000 years, almost all buildings have been built and designed by non-specialists. The most beautiful places today, ably photographed by architects, were not designed by architects but by non-specialists. And he's true about that. Most of the architects tend to go to these kind of places and they find that there is a beauty, maybe a beautiful order expressed in these places. But if you think of that, they're not urban spaces created by maybe one authority in one specific period of time. They generally are this kind of emergent result of building by just regular people with their own land. We have another example of this, for example, Pueblos Blancos in the Mediterranean coast of Spain. These kind of places also show how you have the repetition of some patterns, like the kind of roof you're going to use, how you're going to put your windows, what materials are you going to use, and these kind of rules evolve without the need of a central authority, and in fact create a really coherent and well-functioning order in the moment they were built. Of course, then most of these towns, they were just like deemed as I think you call it like human heritage, and they're not being able to be reformed, but well, at least from that we can get to see a little bit of how these towns were working on the moment they were being developed. In 1965, Alexander wrote a really good essay that is called The Citizenry Tree. And in this essay, he delved a little bit more into the exact problems that central planners have when they try to plan cities. And he explained that you have two different type of structures for the urban environment. One was called by him the semi-lattice structure, and the other was called the tree structure. And what he tried to mean with this was that spontaneous order creates such a complex net of connections, of relations, of overlapping, and in fact of complexity, that you may find that always you have this complete complex interconnection of factors in the development of a spontaneous town or city. But when you try to deal with that complexity, the limitation of the central planner capacity will eventually have to impose some degree of simplification to understand the urban environment and the process. And in this simplification, you are going to, in fact, eliminate some overlapping, some interconnection. And what he said was that this simplification destroys the real essence of cities that make these kind of structures well-functioning. And he always took examples of the modernist planning that you may see all along the former communist countries. Sofia, I think, is a really good example of that. And in this essay, he said that the coherent order that you're trying to reach is unpredictable in detail because each small step is shaped by the interaction of this language with external forces and conditions. The fine details cannot be known ahead of time. It is impossible to predict its detailed plan, and it is not possible to make it grow according to some plan. It must be unpredictable so that the individual acts of building can be free to fit themselves to all local forces which they meet. It creates order not by forcing it, not by imposing it upon the world through plans or drawings or components, but because it is a process which draws order from its surroundings. It allows it to come together. But of course, by this means, far more order can come into being than could possibly come into being through an invented act. It is vastly more complex than any other kind of order. And if we compare this with the Hayekian thought, Hayek said that spontaneous orders are not necessarily complex, but unlike deliberate human arrangement, they may achieve any degree of complexity. Our own main contentions will be that very complex orders comprising more particular facts than any brain could ascertain or manipulate can be brought about only through forces inducing the formation of spontaneous order. And what both authors are trying to say is that this extreme complexity that makes the city or maybe the economy or the social framework a well-functioning structure needs to be emerged by by this interconnection and emergent process in which each element gets a place on the structure to fit themselves and to create the complexity. And on the other hand, you're always going to be limited by the capacity of your mind, your planning group, your planning techniques, etc. And in that limitation, you're going to avoid the needed complexity you need in this structure to be really well-functioning examples. You may see most of European cities have developed over time more or less like this. That's why you have like this always kind of medieval structure in which streets are not perfectly aligned, and you don't have a perfect, maybe homogeneous order around the city, because each person was being able to build their workshop, their residence, to create squares, to align streets, etc. And this merchant process led to most of the cities until around the Renaissance, and from the Renaissance on, the governments, kings, etc. took over cities and started to really plan cities and to make these more simple and hygienic structures. Just to close the talk, I would like to give you an example. I really don't know much about Sofia, so I couldn't get the example of Sofia, but I think that will also be a really good example of these problems. This is the city of Brasilia in Brazil. During the 1950s, Brazil had a really statist government under the presidency of Juscelino Kubitschek, was the president at that moment, and they decided that they needed to move the capital from the coast of Brazil, in which most of the population and of the economy and the industries, etc., is concentrated, to the center of the country that is mainly not populated at all. And they chose just like a little plot on the middle of nowhere in Brazil, and they decided to create a new capital for the country. The Kubitschek selected one of the most important architects at the moment. It was Lucio Costa and Oscar Niemeyer. They created like a contest, architectural contest, and they designed the whole plan for the city. The problem with this city was that, as it was designed during the 50s, the perspective at that moment was that, first of all, everybody was going to have a car and they were going to use it constantly. So they created this completely car-dependent structure in which you have huge boulevards and avenues and streets that are not designed for the people, for the people to walk and to interact with, and that depend on the uses of cars for going from one building to the other. And buildings are also designed just for using cars, and by that I mean that the important things of buildings, for example, shops, work, etc., are concentrated inside the building, are not related to the street. So the problem you have there was that as the car use didn't show to be as important as they expected, the city became like this completely empty scenario in which the streets are extremely huge. It's really hard if you are walking, for example, to go from one side to the other of the street. You have an extremely large scale, so if you are living in one building and you need to get to a shop, you are probably going to need to use your car. It's really hard to live this city through like a pedestrian lifestyle that is basically what you usually have in cities, in which you try to develop most of your activities just going to the place as fast as you can, and not having to take necessarily to your car to go to the other extreme of the city to make whatever you wanted to do, like shops or work or leisure, whatever. And the other point was that the city was completely dependent on government. As it was created for the new capital, most of the activity is not an economical activity per se, it's just administration and government buildings. So it's a city that never developed in a really productive or industrial way. The city now is also deemed as, I think, is human inheritance, something like that, by UNESCO, and so they are not able to change it. But one of the great examples that the city had was, this is the plan of the city. You can see it has like two main axes. This axis was the government axis, and this was the more residential axis. And of course, most of the buildings were just huge towers in the middle of grassland. And one really key story about this city is that just to understand the problems of central planning and this kind of complexity destroying the plans that you were making when you tried to centrally control the cities, was that when they were building this city, they needed to move a lot of people from the coast of Brazil to the center of the country, because in fact there were nobody living in this place to have workforce for the building of the city. And when they moved everybody, they actually forgot to provide residence for these people that were going to stay there for almost a decade to be able to build it. And when the workers get to the place, they started building like an informal city. We built something like a slum around it, just to have a place to live while they were working in the city. And what happened was that the government, when they wanted to inaugurate the city, they wanted the slum just to be away, because they really didn't want a slum next to the new, like the brand new perfect city they were trying to inaugurate. But the people just were refusing to leave, because they have been there for almost a decade now. So they have developed social bonds, they have moved their families from the coast to central Brazil, etc. So a really key example was that when the city was inaugurated, it started with just a spontaneous city around it that was of course not planned and not in the plans of the planners. And it shows a little bit this kind of problems when you try to create and to central plan society. Because don't remember that when you're planning cities, you're not just planning buildings, you're planning economy, the social nets, you're also planning resources, the environment, etc. So it's so complex, the task, that you will always have these kind of complete failures in these kind of plans. And also there's another huge problem with these kind of attempts to create order, because they usually start with a shape and with an order on a plan that doesn't necessarily reflect order on society, even though you may see it like completely ordered, and it's like a symmetric draw and you have all your functions divided. In fact, when you try to make that work, it's not really working and you have completely huge problems. Just to finish this, and so we can go to the questions, we may recall, as Alexander said, that the order we seek cannot be created by decision, it cannot be designed, it cannot be predicted in a plan. It's the living testament of hundreds and thousands of people making their own lives and their inner forces manifest. And we can say that it is true that power has, and city planning has this kind of cohesive nature in which they are trying to lead society to exactly one direction. That is not precisely the direction most of the people want to have. And maybe we can understand that the real problem of central planning not only applied to urban planning, but to any kind of planning, as Hayek said, to the economic environment, is that this is not a dispute as to whether planning is to be done or not. It is a dispute as to whether planning is to be done centrally by one authority for the whole economic system, or is to be divided among many individuals. And I do think that's the key for cities. We should, again, move away from the central planning strategy and go back to this more spontaneous order approach, in which you have a lot of people making cities. You may have different ways of doing that. You may have individual owners creating buildings. You may have enterprises creating complete neighborhoods. But if you move away from this central planning strategy, you will probably be able to have, first of all, competition. You will be able to have different neighborhoods for different people, because not everybody likes to live in the same place and in the same way. And I truly think that we should start trying to research and to manage our cities into really more spontaneous approaches. But, well, that's mainly all. I would like to hear your questions, and maybe even play a kind of devil advocate's case, just to discuss a little bit. I don't know how are we with time?
You have plenty of time, 25 minutes for question and answer session.
Perfect.
You were surprisingly quickly.
So anybody wants to start?
Are there some questions? Who want to start? Okay. No, that's the second one. The first one was there.
Okay. Maybe, yeah. Thank you. Maybe just to clarify, what do you mean by planning centrally the state, the towns? Usually the towns are planned locally by the local authorities, by the mayors or by the regions. And in that case, the towns mainly are not planned by the governments, with some exceptions. In one urban area, you have municipal property, you have also state property. Usually the state property is less. It depends on the towns. But I mean, if we turn to the local planning, it can be combined perfectly with the civil society and with the people in place. And the mayors, as you know, they are very close to the citizens and very close to the people. In that sense, it is maybe wrong to say that the towns are planned centrally. By whom? By the government or by the ministers? Usually they are planned by the local governments, which is completely different from the central governments.
Well, I do agree that if you follow the subsidiarity principle, it is better to have a city planned by local authorities than by the central government on the country. But by central planning, I try to refer to the fact that you are not letting people design their cities. I mean, create new neighborhoods, put the streets where they want to put it, build as high as they want. You have a central authority in the city that is controlling the whole process. It is true that you have different degrees of centralization. You have cities that have been designed from scratch, like Brasilia, this completely designed city by one authority. Usually what you find in cities that you have a centralization of some aspects of that, like for example ordinances telling you how high you can build, how your building has to be, where are you going to put the streets, where you're going to have squares, how much grassland you must have, etc. You have always some degree of centralization, at least in most of the Western world. But that was what I was trying to refer with central planning, not necessarily the national government, but just one authority in the whole area. And that implies a degree of centralization because, for example, in my city, in the downtown, you cannot build, for example, you cannot merge or divide different plots, for example. And that is, in fact, the centralization of the decision of handling the land, for example. That's just like one example of what I want to mean when I say central planning. I don't know if that answers your question. Yes.
I actually have two questions. First one is, can you comment, have you read about the covenant structure that was used in the United Kingdom, in England, to regulate just these questions: height of buildings, width of streets, what you build your houses from, the covenant, because I've read about it, and it's basically a private system of regulation that considers everything surrounding building houses, building shops. That's my first question. And second is, can you comment on gentrification and that process that's happening, especially in the US now? And do you see a link between the need for gentrification, the blight that took over the centers of a lot of American cities, and can you find the link between that and regulation and regulation? So these are the two questions.
Well, regarding the first question, I am not really aware of the example of this kind of covenant laws or process in Great Britain. I mean, maybe just to talk a little bit about that, you have a lot of private means to regulate some areas. I mean, if any one of you have ever been to this kind of contract cities or like private neighborhoods, you have private means to solve this kind of problems of governing the commons sometimes, because it is true that if you want to completely divide every plot of land and try to have a coherent order on that, you may face a problem with like the public aspect of the streets, of how do you interact with each other on the limits of your ground, for example. But there are a lot of private means. I mean, you can choose to live in a neighborhood that you know that it has like a specific set of rules that are developed by the people or by the enterprise that has developed the neighborhood. You can develop your own neighborhood. You can adjust the rules. I mean, there are a lot of private manners to provide that. Sometimes people, for example, ask, how would you handle the problem of cities' utilities, like, for example, the provision of water? The question is that they are trying to think on the regular state structure for cities in which you have like just one owner for the public spaces, and you have like different plots of land that are privately owned. And if you try to privatize that, you're going to have a huge problem on privatizing the whole system, for example, of water provision for the city. But if you have like a more emergent process in which a corporation develops one plot of land and they decide that they're going to hire, for example, this water company for the provision of water, you start solving the problem, because even though they are deciding by you, you are not forced to live there, and they are not changing the rules in your place. You decide in which neighborhood you're going to live, and you decide to what rules you are going to be exposed to. I think that will mainly like deal with that issue. Regarding your second question, I don't see precisely gentrification as a problem per se. Gentrification, for those that don't know, is just the process in which you have an area of the city that has started becoming popular and prices started to rise. So what you have is a lot of middle class and upper class people buying lands and property on that area, and the left used the words like putting like local people away from the place, but in fact it's just like a spontaneous process generally in which what you have is like the actual owners are just deciding to leave the place and to sell it because the prices are just showing a good deal to do. I don't really see a problem with that. You may have some gentrification problems in some US cities because what you may find, for example, is that some limitations of turning down buildings and building some new structures usually put the prices of the place extremely high because you are in fact stepping down the supply of residents of square meters. So prices go extremely high, and what you do have is that a lot of people are not being able to pay for those prices. But if you just leave, for example, the free market to provide more housing in that area, you will probably experiment a decrease on prices, and you won't necessarily need to leave the place if you don't have the money to pay for the rent in that area, for example. So in some facts, I do think it's related to regulation, and in some others, it's just like a natural process of the changing and the evolving of cities. I mean, I don't really think that you have like this complete human right to live in one specific area. I mean, you have the right to have property, and if you can pay for that in that area, that's okay. And if you can't, you just go to some place that's cheaper. I mean, I don't live in the best place in my city, and I don't complain about it. I mean, I will maybe just try to earn more money to move to a better place, but I don't think it's a specific problem on gentrification per se.
Yeah, can I just
yeah, please.
A short note? I totally agree with you. My point was I actually like gentrification. My point was the question was more about the reasons why you have to do gentrification in the first place, because these areas, for some, in my opinion, because of certain policies and central and regulations coming from local and central governments, that's why they turned into places that need gentrification in the first place. They went so bad that at some point you have to gentrify them. That was basically my point. That the reason why we have gentrification is because something went bad before that. Not gentrification is something bad in itself. I think it's actually a good thing.
Well, that could be the place for some areas like that happened a lot in the U.S. because during the 70s and 80s, people went from out of downtown to the periphery of U.S. cities. So all downtowns were mainly abandoned. But what happened during the 90s and this last decade was that people started to see more value on old buildings. So these places became fashionable again. So people started moving back to those places. And it's true that this natural process also helped these places to be renovated and to improve because they have decayed a lot during the previous 3 decades. But again, I don't think that's a problem. It could be good. It also could be bad if it's forced. I mean, sometimes central government, like local governments, decide that some area needs to improve. So what they do is that they impose some regulation, they promote building, and they in fact change the rules of the place. They change the prices by force of the place, and sometimes they start like expelling people. In some cases, like I mean, there are a lot of examples in the U.S., but they sometimes use eminent domain just to take the property away from some owners and to give it to others, sometimes to turn down buildings and build something new, and sometimes just to renovate the buildings and put them on the market. But it's true, I mean, it could be a problem or it couldn't be, depending on the details of how gentrification is going on. But I do agree that if it's like in a spontaneous process, you're probably going to find that a really awful place like downtown Detroit, for example, is turning into like a more developed and nice place to live. You will probably find that. That happened in New York, that happened on the Soho, that happened on the Devil's Kitchen, for example, in New York. There were places that were just old factories that nobody wanted, and a lot of artists started to live in these places, and they started to like put value on that. and it became fashionable, mainly because of New York movies that everybody loves. So a lot of people from abroad started buying places there, and the place is now one of the most expensive places in the US. But I mean, just a lot of people make good money with that, and I don't necessarily see a problem on that. But I think it's...
I would like to play the devil's advocate for a couple of minutes, and of course I would like to hear a commentary on that. First examples of sort of central planning is in some of the earliest urban settlements in human civilization. And these examples, of course, were the seats of power. They had some sort of propaganda function in themselves as a mass communication tool that power of this government, whatever it is above natural processes. So it sets an example of transformation of nature in such a way that it suits a purpose for humanity. Of course, it has religious significance, it has all sorts of significance. And most of the cities, especially those that have roots in ancient history, are still centered around what initially came as a planned seat of power, either for a local government or a government of a nation or a country or whatever. So, in a sense, it's part of natural humanity desire to transform nature, to transcend it, because as our civilization came through agriculture and through overcoming the problems in survival that we had before agriculture, it is probably even genetically ingrained in us to create environments that are as far as possible from natural conditions as we could muster ourselves. In itself, of course, that's a natural process, as we humans are animals. But wouldn't one agree that although economic and social conditions usually created the chaotic environment around the centrally planned seat of power, that examples that we have in history, for example, the Great Plague, or major fires like the 1666 fire of London, which entirely transformed the city, almost burned it down completely, and allowed for then a centrally planned reconstruction. More or less, of course, not entirely. Wouldn't one argue that it is a natural part of human behavior to plan cities in such a way, especially after the Enlightenment, which created the urge for scientific reasoning behind certain societal and economic processes, that planning cities centrally is just a function of this. So arguing that we should go back philosophically to an era which left this chaotic development unchallenged, in a sense, is maybe even, how to put it, wrong on all possible levels. So combating disease, for example, Paris, it was ridden with plenty of disease, partly because of lack of canalization, structures to provide communal services and so on, which Napoleon III actually managed to provide with his new Paris plan and so on and so forth. And of course, natural disasters like the fire of London are better combated when they're established structures that prevent such issues, as the case is in most of central planning issues.
Well, regarding the problem of the human nature of this, I'm not really a psychologist, so I wouldn't go that far on saying that it's on human nature or not. I mean, I think human nature is really contradictory, so I think you will probably have both impulses on that. But regarding your specific question, I mean, I do agree that sometimes you have some technological changes that demand the urban structure to change. But for example, I would like to take on the example of London that you named. The city was burned completely 3 times during 300 years. And each time it was completely burned, the pressure of the market and of the owners was so strong that they managed to keep the streets and the land exactly where it was. So they rebuilt it as the same, like with the same distribution. They didn't change the position of streets mainly. So in fact, London is a really good example of how you can do things differently, because when Napoleon III made the reforms of Paris during it was from 1853 to 1870, with Baron Haussmann, who was more or less like the manager of the process, they completely reshaped the city. Because they have the excuse that if you wanted to provide sewage, if you wanted to change the facilities and the infrastructure of the city, you needed to change that. And in fact, London is the proof that you don't need that. Because in London, you have sewage, you have electricity, you had gas previous to that, you have a lot of urban and city facilities and infrastructure, and they didn't actually change the shape of the city. They didn't need to turn down medieval streets and to widen them up. I mean, they really didn't need that. It may be the case that with some new technology, you will need to change the structure, but I don't necessarily see the problem of having a market process on that. The problem that you do have in cities, and that does impose maybe like a limit on how are you going to be able to maybe liberalize or privatize or move to a market process with actual cities, is that you have in fact a cohesive nature on the property of most of the common places. You don't have would be common property distributed among different owners or maybe administrators. You have just one government that handles all the streets, all the sidewalks, all the parks, all the infrastructure. So the problem you have there is that how are you going to privatize that is physically linked all along the city and that has been designed for just one authority? You can in fact provide that if you are developing a new city. You can have like different contract cities, different models, different like developments that each one can have like one specific manager for the infrastructure, that eventually if they need to change the technology of the place, they could do it in their own zone. But if you have just one manager for the whole place, you will probably need to have like one authority to handle that. I think that the problem is how do you change this kind of bespoke suit made for the state to a more market process. But I don't really see like a real limitation to produce order and infrastructure just through market process. I mean, you have a lot of examples in St. Louis, for example. A lot of streets were built and handled in a private manner. You have any kind of contract city also that provides infrastructure in a private way. I mean, you have centralization, but at least it's voluntary. You are not being controlled by a government that changes and that can restructure your complete agreement with them. In a contract city, you know the rules, they're really clear, you know how to change it or how not to change it, who is going to change it. So even though you have some level of centralization, at least you're voluntarily chosen that, and that helps people feed their needs, their goals, their actions into a larger scheme and not being the victim of some greater plans that just takes away what they were just trying to build. I mean, maybe that could be one of, like, an answer to that.
A little bit off topic.
I cannot find you. Oh, there. I was also looking through.
Our current government's primary agenda is the construction of highways. Now, highways did not used to exist.
You're talking about Bulgaria?
Yes.
Okay.
Highways did not used to exist at a time when you said spontaneous order created infrastructure. And I think that was for a reason, but anyway, move along. How easy do you think it is in practice for 1,000+ landowners, owners of agricultural land, to meet up, get together, or to have the land purchased from them by a single entity and to have a highway built in it? Wouldn't it be just simpler to have that land confiscated from them, as currently the government does, and just compensate them in whatever sum the government deems to be fit for that? Because you know very well that when you have too many heads thinking about something, it's very difficult for them to reach a single conclusion. So don't you think that just having one a great Leviathan to organize them or to just give them a little bit extra push, and by extra push I mean just taking and doing coercion, you know? Wouldn't that be better for society as a whole, or achieving better economic results? I'm not talking about morality, just results.
Yeah, I get
like
it.
GDP growth, etc., etc.
Well, if you avoid all the ethical problem, I have an article on that, but it's in Spanish, so I don't think you're going to be able to read that. But there are a lot of examples through history that show that you can actually do that without the need of government and power and coercion. For example, you have a lot of train lines that were built in the US, even Argentina for some period, and I think that also in Great Britain there must be more examples, but I just don't know them, that show that you have a lot of ways to actually buy the land or buy the right uses of the land in a private manner without like having a kind of holdout in the middle that is going to eventually destroy all your highway plans. What you usually do is that you, for example, you don't have just like one way from one place to another. You have like different like paths, and you usually don't go like completely straight. What you usually do, or what these kind of corporations, like train corporations, did was that they talked to a lot of landowners. And what they said was that, well, your land is not as valuable as it could be with our infrastructure, so we are proposing you just to build the highway. We're going to take whatever route allows us to actually build that. And what you actually had that was that instead of having a holdout, because you have just already started building that, and you haven't already bought all the land on the way, what you had was that in fact prices were going a little bit down because you had a lot of competition of people trying to get the highway on their lands. And it was really easy for them to get. In fact, generally what you find was that you usually get one of the maybe more direct lines from the one place to another, and that was being achieved just through market competition of landowners. There are really good examples on that. Maybe that's not only limited to highways and routes. You know, you have the problem also, for example, if you want to build, for example, an airport, that you can argue that, well, you have problems with the noise, and you have problems with pollution, and with the heights that you can build around because you need the plane to land, so you cannot actually buy all the land in order to the plane to go to a lower altitude to get to land. There also you have maybe a problem of how property rights are defined in most of the world, because as the task of defining property rights has been taken by the government, what you have is that, for example, the underground soil and air rights are not predefined or owned by somebody. So it's really hard. For example, if you want to build your building, you don't exactly know, even though you don't have like a high limit, up to what height are you allowed to do it, or are you owning the air to do that? And it will be easier if you are able to buy and sell these air rights, for example, or these underground rights, because that's also another thing. If you have a holdout in the middle of your highway, for example, I mean, it would be a little bit more expensive, but if you just have one holdout, you could go, I think Walter Block talks a lot about this, you can go just underneath him, but if you own that land, and the question is, he bought the land, does he own the complete quantity of air and soil that goes up and down above him? I mean, that will be another question. Or he just owning like maybe 3 meters behind him and some, I don't know, like 50 meters above him. That will be a really good question of how do you define those property rights.
Okay, then let's stop here because we have no time left. Franco provided some cards that support his lecture there on the desk in the front of you. You can come and take some of them. And then there is a coffee break that will take place in the front of the Sofia hall right here.
Just a little thing. These postcards, I will ask you not to take one of each one, because probably they're not as, I mean, you will probably get at least one, each one of you, but not one of each one. So try just to take like 2 or 3 maybe. And they are all like images refer to historical examples of the problems of central planning, and behind that you have like a more specific explanation about that. So just please serve yourself.
Thank you very much for the great discussion and lecture.
Nice to meet you.